Hi, and thanks for watching this message video. And don't forget to go through the life lesson that goes with it. And for those who can't make a Sunday, don't forget that there's a podcast of that sermon that goes along with this message video and life lesson. Today, we're continuing on in our series where we're looking at all the different names for God and then connecting them to Jesus. And today, we're covering the name Jehovah-Sabbaoth, which means the Lord of Heaven's armies. Now, this name throughout the Bible is used to allude to both the Father and the Son, so that can get a little bit confusing. But one of the most famous instances in Jesus' life where he somewhat refers to his position or the Father's position as the Lord of Heaven's armies was when he was being arrested, and Peter had just pulled out his sword and hacked off a guy's ear, and now Jesus was scolding him. In fact, this is what Jesus said. Matthew 26:52 through 54. "Put away your sword," Jesus told him. "Those who use the sword will die by the sword. Don't you realize that I could ask my Father for thousands of angels to protect us, and he would send them instantly? But if I did, how would the scriptures be fulfilled that describe what must happen now?" Now, the truth is, a lot of people have heard of this name that has been used for God, especially if they've read through the Bible at all. But the truth is guys like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Joshua, they never used this name to describe God. And the reason is, Israel didn't think of themselves as a nation or understand the need for an army until after they left Egypt. For example, when the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, changed his mind and decided he didn't want the Hebrew people to leave after all, he sent his armies to go and collect them and bring them back. And that was one of the instances when the Hebrew people recognized their need for an army, but they didn't have one. But God stepped up and protected them, obviously. But then later on, after they left Egypt, they're facing the Amalekites. And if you remember that battle, Joshua was down there with a makeshift army of Israel, but they didn't win because of their military strategy. They won because Moses was holding up the staff of God. So as a result, the people started to learn at that point in time that not only did they need an army, but God was the one who was somewhat fighting for them. And so over a period of time, it wasn't just Yahweh that they knew God for, it was Jehovah-Sabbaoth, Yahweh, the Lord of Heaven's armies. And this continued to be something that developed throughout all the years after Joshua had led the children of Israel into the promised land. And the judges had all been set up over time. That's the name that they started to learn. In fact, I know some people have probably heard the name of Samuel, but they don't remember the miraculous circumstances associated with his birth. Let's take a look at that. And again, this is the very first time in the overall timeline of the Bible that the name Jehovah-Sabbaoth is actually written down and recorded in the timeline. 1 Samuel 1 through 11. There was a man named Elkanah who lived in Ramah in the region of Zuph, in the hill country of Ephraim. He was the son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, the son of Tohu, son of Zuph of Ephraim. Elkanah had two wives, Hannah and Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah did not. Each year, Elkanah would travel to Shiloh to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of Heaven's armies at the tabernacle. The priests of the Lord at that time were the two sons of Eli, Hophni and Phinehas. On the days Elkanah presented his sacrifice, he would give portions of the meat to Peninnah and each of her children. And though he loved Hannah, he would give her only one choice portion because the Lord had given her no children. So Peninnah would taunt Hannah and make fun of her because the Lord had kept her from having children. Year after year, it was the same. Peninnah would taunt Hannah as they went to the tabernacle. Each time, Hannah would be reduced to tears and would not even eat. "Why are you crying, Hannah?" Elkanah would ask. "Why aren't you eating? Why be downhearted just because you have no children? You have me. Isn't that better than having 10 sons? Once, after a sacrificial meal at Shiloh, Hannah got up and went to pray. Eli the priest was sitting at his customary place beside the entrance of the tabernacle. Hannah was in deep anguish, crying bitterly as she prayed to the Lord. And she made this vow, "O Lord of Heaven's armies, if you will look upon my sorrow and answer my prayer and give me a son, then I will give him back to you. He will be yours for his entire lifetime. And as a sign that he has been dedicated to the Lord, his hair will never be cut." Jehovah-Sabbaoth answered Hannah's prayer, and indeed she had a son, named him Samuel, and she did bring him back to the tabernacle where he lived as a servant of the Lord for all of his life. And again, if you've read some of that Old Testament portions of the Bible, you know a lot about Samuel's life and how God used him. But the point is, after years of learning how to be a unified nation of tribes, the Israelites began to refer to Yahweh as the Lord of Heaven's armies because of the many stories of God helping Israel's armies. However, the Israelites made a huge mistake in that their leaders started to believe that they could wield the power of God, or that they could command the commander or Lord of Heaven's armies by just simply taking the symbol of his power and utilizing it. For instance, if you're not familiar with Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, this is after he took over, and what God had asked him to do was to march around Jericho, and God demonstrated his power supernaturally over all of those in Jericho because of the Ark of the Covenant being out there in front of the children of Israel, which is where the staff of Moses was in, if you remember. And so these guys believed that as long as they had the symbol of God's power, whether it was the staff of Moses or the Ark of the Covenant, which contained the staff of Moses, that no matter what, they could then wield the power of God or command the Lord of Heaven's armies to fight on their behalf. Here's an example of this kind of confusion in the way that they thought. 1 Samuel 4:1-3. At that time, Israel was at war with the Philistines. The Israelite army was camped near Ebenezer, and the Philistines were at Aphek. The Philistines attacked and defeated the army of Israel, killing 4,000 men. After the battle was over, the troops retreated to their camp, and the elders of Israel asked, "Why did the Lord allow us to be defeated by the Philistines?" Then they said, "Let's bring the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord from Shiloh. If we carry it into battle with us, it will save us from our enemies." So, as if they called a timeout in the whole battle with the Philistines, they march off to Shiloh, and then they come back, and we're told that when the Ark of the Covenant is now arriving into the camp, that the shouts of all of the Israelites was so loud that it not only shook the ground, but it alerted the Philistines that, I think timeout's over. In fact, here's what we're told happened next. 1 Samuel 4:6-11. "What's going on?" the Philistines asked. "What's all the shouting about in the Hebrew camp?" When they were told it was because the Ark of the Lord had arrived, they panicked. "The gods have come into their camp," they cried. "This is a disaster. We have never had to face anything like this before. Help! Who can save us from these mighty gods of Israel? They are the same gods who destroyed the Egyptians with plagues when Israel was in the wilderness. Fight as never before, Philistines. If you don't, we will become the Hebrew slaves, just as they have been ours. Stand up like men and fight." So the Philistines fought desperately, and Israel was defeated again. The slaughter was great. 30,000 Israelite soldiers died that day. The survivors turned and fled to their tents. The Ark of God was captured, and Hophni and Phinehas, the two sons of Eli, were killed. Even though Jehovah-Sabbaoth could have done something to spare the Israelite armies from the Philistine armies with the heavenly armies, he didn't. He chose not to. Think about it. These Hebrew people knew that God could do a lot of destruction in one night. They remembered, perhaps, that on the night of the Passover, he came through and his death angel killed an awful lot of Egyptians, not just people, but animals, in one night. Later on in the overall story of the Israelites, we're told that one death angel killed 185,000 Assyrian soldiers in one night. It was just one angel, not even an army. And so we know that God could have done something in this situation, but he chose not to. And the reason why was because he wanted to teach the Israelites, the Hebrew people, a very valuable lesson, particularly their leadership, a very valuable lesson. That lesson being, from a biblical perspective, God never allows anyone to wield his power indiscriminately. Meaning, no matter what biblical story we will ever read, we will always need to understand that every demonstration of power, doesn't matter who was the one who was wielding it, that power was allowed by God for a very specific reason. And so when he doesn't use his power or doesn't allow for his power to be wielded by somebody, it's for a very specific reason. And again, I want to stress, when it came to these Israelites, God didn't show his power through Israel's armies because he was trying to correct their bad way of thinking, which is what Jesus does with us at times. For instance, let me give you a specific instance of where God put a person in timeout who happened to be an individual who he loved but was experiencing some bad thinking. It was Paul, the apostle. For those of you who read the New Testament, you know that he had a really big, ugly, toxic fight with his good, maybe even best friend Barnabas that led to a split. And afterwards, Paul chose a man named Silas to go with him on his missionary work, but even he admits that it seems like God was restricting him or preventing him from the areas where he was wanting to do ministry as if he was in a timeout. However, even when Jesus has to discipline us, the people who should be used to display his power, he still demonstrates his power to those like the Philistines who fight him. In fact, let's revisit this story of the Ark of God when it was taken by the Philistines and Jehovah-Sabbaoth appeared to not do anything about it. But yes, he did have a plan to do something about it. 1 Samuel 5:1-7. After the Philistines captured the Ark of God, they took it from the battleground at Ebenezer to the town of Ashdod. They carried the Ark of God into the temple of Dagon and placed it beside an idol of Dagon. But when the citizens of Ashdod went to see it the next morning, Dagon had fallen with his face to the ground in front of the Ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and put him in his place again. The next morning, the same thing happened. Dagon had fallen face down before the Ark of the Lord again. This time, his head and hands had broken off and were lying in the doorway. Only the trunk of his body was left intact. That is why, to this day, neither the priests of Dagon nor anyone who enters the temple of Dagon in Ashdod will step on its threshold. Then the Lord's heavy hand struck the people of Ashdod and the nearby villages with a plague of tumors. When the people realized what was happening, they cried out, "We can't keep the ark of the God of Israel here any longer. He is against us. We will all be destroyed along with Dagon, our God." As you can see, when the children of Israel, or the Israelites, or the Hebrew people left Egypt, they had a mindset of God that he was Yahweh, that he was Jehovah, that he was the one who was definitely going to help lead them into a promised land. However, as they started to recognize that all kinds of battles were now in front of them that they needed to face, they recognized the need for an army. And that's when it started to change, where God became now Jehovah-Sabbaoth, the Lord of heaven's armies. They recognized their need for a leader who would oversee them and fight for them in their battles. The problem was that they started to believe that they could wield the power of God to do whatever it is that they wanted to do and fight whatever battles they wanted to fight on their own strength. That's a problem. That's what a lot of people now ultimately look toward Jesus, who is the Lord of heaven's armies, and that they believe that they could wield Jesus's power for whatever it is that they want, however it is that they want, indiscriminately. But the truth is, Jesus, our Jehovah-Sabbaoth, will always choose to wield his power through whoever he wants, and there's always a reason. And when he chooses to not use his power through somebody, there's always a reason. So, one of the things that you and I need to do is to recognize that, yes, Jesus is the Lord of heaven's armies. He is Jehovah-Sabbaoth, and he, like he stated, he could easily ask the Father for thousands of angels to fight any battle. But if there is a plan that God has for you and I that involves something where he does not want to use that power the way that we would want, then he's going to use his power in a different way. Or if you and I have bad thinking, and if you and I are not in a place where we are acting correctly or living righteously, then God will remove his power. He will choose not to use his power in people in order to make a point. So the thing that you and I need to do as followers of Jesus is recognize, is God using his power through us? And if so, for what purposes? And if not, why not?